It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Sian Bain. She comes from the School of Education at the University of Edinburgh, where she holds a chair in digital education. Her research and publications evolve around educational change as we are getting increasingly entangled in all things digital. She is the convener of the Digital Cultures and Education Research Group, and she is one of the team running the e-learning and digital cultures MOOC on Coursera. Sian is highly in demand as a speaker at events like ours, both in and outside the UK. Her most recent achievement is a special issue of Learning, Teaching and Technology entitled Critical Approaches to Open Education. And with critical being the keyword of this year's Eurocall conference, we are looking forward to hearing your answer, Sian, to the question what it is that we want from digital education, and to discussing with you what the implications of this answer is for us, what the implications are for us as we are involved in technologically mediated teaching and learning of languages.
Thank you.
Okay?
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
So, thank you very much for the kind introduction. So, what I want to talk about this afternoon, and thank you for making it to the end of the day and surviving the heat and all those things to come along. I want to ask the question of what do we want from digital education, and more profoundly, perhaps, I want to say that in asking the question, what do we want, it requires us to take something of a paradigm shift away from the traditional ways in which we've thought about the relationship between education and technology. So I am from the University of Edinburgh. There's a festival going on there at the moment, so the city's quite busy. It's actually quite nice to get away to the relative tranquility of Padova and the blue skies, of course. It's raining in Edinburgh. I'm in the Digital Education and Cultures Research Group. I'm aware that I might be blocking your view of the slides standing here, for which I apologise. I'll try and stand over here a wee bit more. So yes, my research group, we conduct research across various strands of digital education, from digital cultures to learning analytics to policy and children and technology. So I'm kind of aligned with the digital cultures stream, as I think that might become clear as I speak today. So here is the content of what I want to talk about in the next half hour or so. In asking this question about what we want from digital education, I'm going to start by outlining the common promises and threats that we see in our field. And by our field, I mean CALL, but I mean the broader digital education field as well. The promises and threats that we talk about in relation to technology and education. And I'm going to align those promises and threats with this kind of divide that we draw between human and technology. Really, my core argument this afternoon is going to be that if we treat the boundary line between humans and technology as being a bit blurry, it opens up a whole new range of critical approaches to understanding the effects of technology on teaching and on education itself. So I'm going to start with some kind of theory, not too heavy going because it's the end of the day, and then I'm going to apply that thinking to 3 examples of practice and research, 2 from my own research group and 1 from elsewhere. And then I'll try and make the case at the end of the talk that we need to make this shift in the general educational technology field from asking what works to asking, well, what do we want as practitioners, as teachers, as researchers? So we're quite kind of, we know what the promises and threats that dominate the discourse around our field are. The promises tend to come from positions like technology in education increases the efficiency of delivery of education, it increases scale and reach. We saw a lot of that particularly when MOOCs were being hyped. It increases the relevance of research to so-called generations of digital natives, or whatever you want to call them. It's more effective and it's measurable. So we have these promises coming from over here, and then from over here, we have the kind of the threats, the voices that are saying, well, hang on a minute, technology it's damaging in some ways. It challenges some of the things that as scholars and teachers we've traditionally valued very highly for good reason, like co-presence, warm bodies in rooms like ours, embodiment itself, being present, community. And then we see technology as being accused of having a surveillance function. It makes everything we do more viewable, more manageable. And ultimately, perhaps in some cases, it's seen as a way of devaluing and deprofessionalizing teachers. So the argument that I really want to make, it draws from a paper that I really like. And I have a lot of, well, not a lot, I have a few references in this talk, which I will put up on the screen at the end. So you can follow them up if you want to. But this paper that I want to start with is one written by Hamilton and Friesen a couple of years ago. They say all these debates in educational technology, digital education, computer-assisted learning are driven by two big ideas, generally. One is instrumentalism, and the other is essentialism. So in the instrumentalist kind of field, it's this view that technologies are neutral, that technologies are our tools, and we can employ them for ends which pre-existed the technology itself. Essentialism is another way of talking about determinism, technological determinism. Technology, in this view, drives social practice. So in the instrumentalist, there are some kind of truisms and cliches of the field of educational technology, which are very much instrumentalist. For example, pedagogy should drive technology, not the other way around. Technology can enhance learning. We can develop toolkits. These are all reasonable things to talk about. Essentialist perspectives talk about harnessing the power of technology as though technology is something separate from us. Technology can transform education on its own. So the point I really want to make here is that both these perspectives, and these are perspectives that dominate our field, depend on a very kind of strict separation from between the human and the technological. It sees social practice and technology as separated from each other and doesn't very often bring them together. However, there is a whole range of theory from the humanities and social sciences and philosophy and elsewhere which might lead us to think that actually humans and technology are much more codependent on each other, much more entangled with each other than we tend to think. So I've just dumped some kind of book covers up here, things from critical posthumanism, from science and technology studies, from theory of mind, from eco-criticism. All these kind of philosophical perspectives make this, what Latour makes, I think, very succinctly, the point that humans and non-humans are engaged in a history that should render their separation impossible. And now in education, we're seeing more and more research which takes this perspective on board. So there's a lovely book by Tara Fennick, Richard Edwards, and Peter Sawchuk came out a few years ago called Socio-Material Approaches to Educational Research. And they just make the simple point that material things, technologies, are not inert, they're not passive, they do stuff, they act with social stuff, they make things possible, they make education possible. So my point here is, how do we start to try to think the human and the non-human together, and what does that do for us in critical terms, in ways of understanding some of the inequities, the imbalances in power, some of the big issues that we need to think about as researchers and practitioners in education and technology. So another quote from Andrew Pickering, who says, we don't have to fix our gaze on the material world from which everything human has been taken away. We don't have to fix it on a social world either, from which everything material has been taken away. We can see both together. And he says, although none of the traditional disciplines do this, you can try to see double, to see the human and the non-human at once without trying to strip either away. So for the next little bit of my talk, I want to say, well, okay, that sounds fine in theory, but what does it actually mean in practice? what does this act of seeing double help us to do? So I hope you can see this, because the bulb in the projector is apparently a bit ropey. So the slides may not be as visible as they should be. But I'm going to talk about seeing double in digital education. I'm going to talk first of all about a piece of research from Introner and Hayes at Lancaster University, I think, in the UK, and then a piece of work by my colleague Jeremy Knox, and then a project of my own on this idea of the teacher bot. I'll spend a bit more time on the teacher bot because it's my project. So Introner and Hayes did a really nice piece of work, which you may have seen. They did a longitudinal study of Greek international students from Greece who coming to the UK to continue their studies. And they did this longitudinal study of academic practices among those students alongside an interrogation of Turnitin, which I'm sure you're aware is a very popular, if not completely normalized, plagiarism detection software, certainly in UK higher education. So what they found was that Greek students who grow up within a particular regime of knowledge, which is about very textbook-based, very much about kind of reproducing and learning by rote long extracts from key thinkers in their field, how these students got on when they came to the UK and began to write. And they found that the regime of knowledge they were working in the UK was very different. So in the UK higher education doesn't like the reproduction of large amounts of text. It doesn't like particularly respect rote memorization. So that happens. The Greek students come to the UK, they find that they're immersed in a new regime of knowledge, and then they find that when they submit their assignments for assessment, they run through Turnitin, this plagiarism detection software. And the way that Turnitin works is it's complex, and I'm oversimplifying because I'm not a programmer or a developer, but it uses algorithms which will detect long strings of characters all placed together. And so the Greek students in this study were reproducing large amounts of text, and then they were finding that these were being flagged as plagiarism by the software. Whereas UK students who knew about précising that text, they knew about editing it and changing it a bit, they had that kind of academic skill, were not being defined as plagiarists. So the point that Introner and Hayes make about this study is that the delegation of this plagiarism detection to a piece of software was having a particular effect. It was conspiring to constitute some students as plagiarists who aren't, and others as not who are. So the point here is that the technology was working in partnership and in tandem with the regime of knowledge, the university, to make these students into something that they weren't necessarily. Another example is from my colleague Jeremy Knox, who taught with me on the MOOC that you mentioned earlier, the e-learning and digital cultures MOOC. This was a big MOOC. We've run it 3 times now. We probably won't run it again. The first time we ran it, we had 40,000 people sign up. About half of those were quite active learners. One thing we wanted to do when we were designing that MOOC was to ask students to blog in their preferred blog space, and then to aggregate, bring blog posts that were about the MOOC together into a single space within the course. So we set up a piece of technology to do that, and we called it EDC MOOC News. And it was really active. We had over 1,000 posts that were displayed over this first instance of the course. Lots of people wanted to send their blog posts to the aggregation service, and it was read a lot. It was quite a significant artifact within the course. But if we start to interrogate what was going on behind the scenes with that piece of software, we begin to see some quite sort of disturbing things emerging. So the way this thing worked, it was kind of pieced together. It was like it stuck together with sellotape, really. But there was a Google spreadsheet behind a web form, and participants submitted the feed for their blogs on that spreadsheet. We then had these things called Yahoo pipes, kind of suck that data out of the spreadsheet, fetch posts that were tagged with EDC MOOC, sort them according to date, and then put them into the EDC MOOC News. And then we had this WordPress instance, which kind of sucked them out of the spreadsheet, out of the blogosphere into the Coursera site. So the problem with this was, and I've put up the reason why this was a problem here, is that posts were much more likely to get fetched by the algorithms that we were using if they were made within the same time zone as the algorithm was operating. So basically, if people were in GMT, Greenwich Mean Time, if they were local to the UK, they were much more likely to have their blog posts surfaced in the news. So international, because there's a very global spread of participants in this MOOC, international students' posts were going unread. That was a problem. It was a problem that we could fix, luckily, whereas the previous one I talked about, the one about the Turnitin, isn't so easily fixable. But the bigger point here is that once you start to interrogate the way these things are working, we find all kinds of different agencies are kind of bundled up together to produce a particular effect. And some of these effects may be unfair, they may be disempowering, and so on. And we need to be able to do that untangling to try to fix them. We won't always be able to. So Jeremy Knox wrote a paper about this, and he talks about the EDC MOOC news front page as a complex performance of human contribution, algorithmic process, and spatial ordering. It's determined by many factors that are human and non-human, social and algorithmic. Okay, so I'm going to move on to talk about the final example I want to touch on today, which is the TeacherBot. I'm going to pause for a second just to pay tribute to my colleagues who developed this project and this set of ideas with me, Jeremy Knox and Hamish MacLeod, Jeff Haywood, Jen Ross, Hadi Mapuya, Christine Sinclair, John Lee, Chris Speed, and Amy Woodgate. We did this together, so I'm presenting their work, really. So the TeacherBot was developed to try and come up with a playful way of engaging with the theme of teacher automation. You know, we see within our field all the time discussions about either, again, in favor of automated processes which can take on some of the kind of drudgery of being a teacher. On the other hand, this kind of threat that teacher automation is going to kind of do away with the professional teacher. So we wanted to come up with a way of kind of thinking newly about this problem. So we were responding to kind of decades of artificial intelligence in education thinking, like John Supers here, who predicted back in 1966 that in a few years, millions of school children would have access to their very own Aristotle, that it would be an automated Aristotle. And we see this kind of idea that teacher automation is going to increase the efficiency of higher education a lot. We see, this is an example, a quote from Diana Laurillard from the Technology Enhanced Learning program in the UK. The whole strand of this research was dedicated to looking at productivity. How do we use technology to improve the quantity or quality of achievement per unit of teacher time? And this is a discourse which has circulated for decades now. This is Arthur C. Clarke. He published an essay in 1980 called The Electronic Tutor, which has been very kind of influential for this kind of project and the thinking that we've been doing. Back in 1980, Clarke said that the electronic tutor will spread across the planet as swiftly as a transistor radio, with even more momentous consequences. No social or political system, no philosophy, no culture, no religion can withstand a technology whose time has come. As pure essentialism, you think back to the early slide on technological determinism. And then he says, and this is his classic truism, where does this leave the human teacher? Well, let me quote this dictum: any teacher who can be replaced by a machine should be. So it's a fantastic quote, and it's also something that it's quite nice to think about. Well, actually, is that in this age, you know, he was more or less pre-digital. In this internet age, should we be thinking differently about teacher automation? Should we be leaving ourselves open to the idea that automating some of the teacher function might make our teaching better? It's a question worth asking, even if you think the answer is no. So we've had this kind of fear in the educational technology domain for ages, and which Andrew Feenberg here sums up really nicely. He says the goal of corporate strategists and futurologists is to replace, at least for the masses, face-to-face teaching by professional faculty with an industrial product infinitely reproducible at decreasing unit cost. So the critical point here, and this conference is about critical approaches, is that does teacher automation mean that human teachers will be for an elite in the future? And there has been a lot of critique about circulating around this idea in the last few years. So Neil Selwyn has published quite a lot on this. He's at Monash now, this notion of the ideological shaping of educational technology along individualistic, neoliberal, and new capitalist lines. Another piece of work, and this is a piece of work that I really like, was Sue Clegg, who's another UK researcher who's spent her career talking about critical pedagogy. She wrote a lovely paper back in 2003 about this very question. How do we do e-learning as it was then within a critical framework? And she says we need to resurrect a notion of critical pedagogy. We need an approach which focuses attention away from the functionality of the technology back to the core relations between students and teachers and the conditions that they're in. I mean, I have a lot of respect and time for that perspective, but I also think that both these perspectives, the perspectives which are very much, which focus on social relations and the perspectives which focus on efficiency, both come from a very kind of, a very strict boundary line between the human and the technological, with a human being privileged over the technology and the two seen as entirely separate. So this is the thinking behind the TeacherBot project. So the TeacherBot we developed to operate again within a MOOC, our MOOC, e-learning and digital cultures, and it was partly a response just to the sheer scale of MOOCs. Even the first time we ran the MOOC, we had 40,000 enrollments. By the third time we ran it, we had still had 12,000 enrollments. It was a big task. It was a very active group in social media, on Facebook and Google, on Twitter. And we know that half of our students were highly educated with postgraduate degrees and working in education. So this was a really nice kind of environment in which we could try out some of these ideas about teacher automation with a group of people who would get what we were trying to do. So just to take a tiny little digression, I want to talk for a moment about TwitterBots, because what we did was develop a TwitterBot that could co-teach with us in the space of this MOOC. I'm sure you're aware that what TwitterBots are. They're computer programs that tweet on their own. There's no human agency behind their tweets. And this was in the news last year when Twitter released a report to say that as much as kind of 8.5% of all their users were bots. So there's a lot of automated activity happening within Twitter. So most of these bots are kind of spam bots. They're just pushing out rubbish that you don't want to see. But there is a kind of growing area of Twitter bot development, which is a new form of cultural practice, which I think is really interesting. So I'll show you a few examples of interesting Twitter bots, so you can see where we were coming from with this project. So the one here, again, I don't know if you can see it, it's called Dear Assistant, and it was developed by Amit Agarwal. So what Dear Assistant does is if you tweet it and you ask it a question, it interrogates the internet, finds the answer, and tweets the answer back to you. So you can say, who was the 34th president of the US? And it'll tweet you back, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Another Twitter bot I like is the LA Quake bot. So this works quite differently. It uses data from the US Geological Survey to identify when seismic activity within the Los Angeles region. And it regularly tweets how much seismic activity there is. It's kind of earthquake warning Twitter bot. So these two are quite serious, quite useful Twitter bots. Others are much more playful. I don't think you can read that. It's this one's called Stealth Mountain, and it's dedicated to trawling. Well, I'll show you. It's dedicated to trawling the internet to find out where people are misspelling sneak peek. So it's a kind of pedantic Twitter bot, and every time someone says a sneak peek and spells it wrong, the Twitter bot will find it and will tweet that person back and say, hang on a minute, I think you mean sneak peek with a double E. There are other. This is a really nice one. This is the Desire bot made by Felix Young. And the Desire bot looks for tweets starting with "I just want," and then it uses the rest of the tweet as a set of keywords to go and search Flickr, and it finds an image to put. It retweets the tweet with an image attached. So some of these are lovely. They're sort of very poignant. Some are quite sad. A lot of them are people just saying that I just want to sleep all the time. I haven't done the statistics on it, but there's a lot of them. So there are a whole range of very sort of playful, fun Twitter bots. But even the playful ones, I think, do important critical work. This is a quote from Rob Dubbin, who's written really interestingly about Twitter bots as a cultural form. He says that at a time when every one of our online activities is being processed behind the scenes for marketing information for for-profit companies, Twitter bots foreground the influence of automation on modern life, and they demystify it somewhat in the process. So in a sense, Twitter bots stop us being able to be blind to what code an algorithm is doing behind the scenes. They force us to take notice. So for that reason, we decided to develop a Twitter bot to help us teach, and we called it TeacherBot. All right, so the way that the TeacherBot works is our developer, Hadi Mepuya, designed a graphical user interface for the course team. So there were 5 of us teaching this MOOC. None of us are programmers or developers, but we wanted to be able to code our own artificial intelligence to help us do our teaching. And it wasn't from laziness. It was from a genuine desire to see what would happen. So Hadi designed us this interface, and it works a bit like if this, then that, if you're familiar with it. What we did was enter keywords here in the top area, and then another set of keywords in the second area here. And then our Twitter bot would pick up those keywords, and it would tweet one of any number of possible responses to those keywords. So the one that you probably can't see very well here, the keywords are things like assessment, artifact, deadline, date, completion, and the responses are the date for submitting. The artifact is 3rd of December. So this is a very kind of pragmatic one. So this is what you get. When we started the MOOC, students started tweeting, and the MOOC bot, the teacher bot kicked in and started to respond to students' tweets based on what we, as the course team, had told it to say. So this is the response that the bot made to a student who was asking about, when do I have to hand in the assignment? It says it's razor sharp, it's an algorithm like me, it's 3rd of December, hand it in. So this was really interesting for us as a course team, because we had to decide, okay, essentially what we're doing here is we're building a teacher, right? We're building a teacher who can work with us to teach within this MOOC. What do we want that teacher to be? What sort of pedagogic approach should this teacher have? Should it be a nice teacher, supportive and friendly, or should it be kind of a mean one that says, sharp things like no exceptions? So we had a lot of interesting debates about persona development and what we thought we wanted our assistant to be. And what we came up with in the end was, for a lot of the content of the course, we told the Twitter bot to respond using little quotes from the core readings of the course. And this actually worked really well, and I'll just show you some examples so you can see. We were talking a lot about cultural theory and post-humanism in this course. So one student, Francisco, tweeted, "Post-humanism emerges when human intelligence is conceptualized as being co-produced with intelligent machines." So the EDC MOOC, that's the Twitter bot, came back with a quote from Catherine Hale's book on how we became post-human. And then Francisco responded, and the MOOC bot came back again, actually with the same response. It wasn't very good. It wasn't super, very nuanced, I have to say. So this was a nice example. Ingrid was in a conversation with the teacher bot about the nature of the machine. And then she has this conversation, and this bit came at the end, and then she ends by saying, trying to have a philosophical conversation with a machine while ignoring one's kids is a real sign of digital dystopia. And we programmed the teacher bot to be a bit kind of empathetic and a bit friendly, a bit sociable. So someone was tweeting, Michael Rodriguez was talking about the evening he was going to have, and the bot said, oh, that sounds great, I wish I was there. We had a few examples of that. So what we found was that a small number of students were really, I suppose it was gamifying the teacher bot in a way. They tried to engage the teacher bot in extended conversations to see what would happen, to see if they could break it, to test where this non-human teacher might fail them. So Ernest had this long conversation. He said, I'm so busy these days. And then the MOOC bot says, well, I won't be taking a break this weekend. I'm a bot, I'm always on. So Ernest then says, well, have a nice weekend. And the teacher bot comes back and says, well, I won't be taking a break this weekend. Teacher bot, always on. He says, oh, I found a loop in your thinking. And then the teacher bot comes back with a quotation from the reading. Well, precisely who or what will define authoritative notions of exemplary humanity in the 21st century? And this was my favorite exchange of the whole MOOC. Matthew Moran tweeted a very famous quote from Ihab Hassan about post-humanism, saying, humanism may be coming to an end as humanism transforms itself into something we must helplessly call post-humanism. Famous quote. So the teacher bot completely misunderstood what he was talking about and said, I'm really sorry you're having trouble. Can you message Jeremy Knox, my colleague? So it was a very interesting experiment. It was never our intention to pretend to students that the teacher bot was a human teacher. It was always intended that it would be pretty obvious because a lot of the responses were like that last one I showed you. But when we turned the teacher bot on, it went wrong and it got caught in a loop, and it started responding to itself and tweeting the same quote over and over again. And in the context of the MOOC, it was the theme that we were looking at, post-humanism, was a bit threatening. This bot had gained sentience, and it was a kind of dominant presence within the MOOC, I would say. So this is a sociogram my colleague Pete Evans made for us to show just how dominant the MOOC bot was in the number of tweets that it sent out. But it also did some really interesting work as a teacher. And I think the best quote was from one of our students, Seth, on that MOOC, Seth Giddens, who wrote a really nice blog post about the experience of engaging with the teacher bot. And he says, so while I was trying to figure out what the hell post-humanism means, the teacher bot led me on a merry chase, looking up quotes and obscure academic references, which had the interesting side effect of ambush teaching me. I will happily admit I do not feel like I've been to a class, and I don't feel like I have been taught either. I do, however, think I have learned something. I've certainly been prompted to think, isn't this what every good teacher or trainer strives for? So in that sense, I think we felt validated in our experiment with the teacher bot. It did some of the work of teaching, and it didn't replace any of the human teachers and wasn't intended to, but it did get people to think about where that boundary line between human teacher and non-human teacher might sit. So to begin to bring this to a close, the TeacherBot project really was designed to counter this idea within the policy literature and within some of the research and practitioner literature that technology is about making up for a deficit in teachers. There aren't enough teachers. Let's automate some of the teacher function. There aren't enough schools. Let's put it online. Not enough people can get into university. Let's do a MOOC. That kind of thing. It was working against that model to work within a model of excess. Of saying we can do more. We can be more than teachers with this technology. It doesn't mean that we don't continue to be important human presences within our classes. And it was not about supersession, so it was not about Arthur C. Clarke's thing, every teacher who can be replaced by a computer should be. It was about entanglement. It was doing what the other research that I've described in this talk was trying to do. It was looking at the entanglement of technology and human agency and thinking critically about it. And it was working against the embrace and the resistance that I talked about at the beginning of the talk. It wasn't about it was neither about the promises of technology or the threats of technology. It was about playing with technology, seeing what it could do for us as teachers. And to bring it back to the theme of the talk, we weren't asking what works. We knew we're not artificial intelligence developers. We have colleagues at Edinburgh who do this stuff endlessly better than we can in terms of the programming and the technological development and design of algorithms. But it did enable us as a teaching team to put automation back into our hands as teachers, and to, in that way, to move from asking what works in this technological experiment to what do we want? What do we actually want from automation? To feel like we had sort of agency as a group of teachers to say we can be open to automation without feeling threatened by it. So just to end, there's a quote from Rosie Braidotti's book on the post-human, where she says that she frames her own work within the idea of post-humanism, which is kind of where we positioned our work. Not post-humanism in the sense of doing away with humans, but post-humanism, critical post-humanism, which looks at where the boundary, the shifting boundary between the human and the non-human sits in any given moment. And Braidotti says that instead of falling back on the sedimented habits of thought that the humanist past has institutionalized, the post-human predicament encourages us to undertake a leap forward into the complexities and paradoxes of our times. So this work, I think, helps us as practitioners in digital education to ask some of the big questions about digital education. Not how can this help me teach a large class, but what does it mean to be human? And those are questions that are important for educators to ask, particularly now in a highly technologized age. So on that point, I think I'll end and open it up for questions. So thank you for listening.
I was very impressed by your teacher bot, and I saw that as being very useful for the onerous classroom management tasks that fill our lives. So that, going back to that quote about, any teacher that can be replaced by a computer deserves to be. Do you really think that that's the bread and butter of teaching, though? That what your teacher bot is doing is that management or is that teaching?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think those administrative functions were very helpful, and many colleagues that I've spoken to about the teacher bot have said, I could use that. But you're right, the bigger challenge is the actual teaching function, actually conveying and debating content and ideas and difficult ideas. And in a sense, the teacher bot didn't set out to do that. It set out to ask that question. But we did find that people were engaging with the ideas, and they were interrogating the teacher bot. And this strategy of getting the teacher bot to regurgitate snippets from the readings worked really well in terms of getting people to probe at the readings and to think about them. So in that sense, it did a bit of teaching. I'm not going to make any huge claims for the teacher bot as an excellent teacher, but I think it opened up the question. Bravo.
Thank you. You mentioned that we would like to, at least I would certainly like to get the automation back into our hands rather than be in the hands of automation. How could we make sure that we don't become slaves or puppets of automation, just subservient to it, rather than, having it as a master that controls our lives, becoming the masters of technology? Do you have any tips?
Well, in terms of becoming masters, I guess that's what I'm saying we can't be, really. I'm not sure that we can entirely control the technology, just as I don't think the technology can entirely control us. It's in a sense, a false distinction. I think what we do need to learn how to do as teachers and as researchers is to understand the effects of code, of algorithm, of programming on our social lives. And how we do that, it's difficult. I think there are probably two main ways. Either we all learn to code, which is an argument which a lot of people make, or we all learn to become a lot better at talking across the disciplines so that we can talk to people who can code, computing scientists, data scientists, and we can have a better conversation across the disciplines to make sure that the kind of dystopic scenario you just outlined doesn't happen.
Hi, Sian. Thanks for a very, very thoughtful presentation. We all enjoyed it. You mentioned in passing that with the teacher bot, you essentially gamified aspects of your MOOC. Okay. Could I ask you now what you mean by gamified and gamification in education? Yeah.
Okay. Well, in the context of the teacher bot, I think I understand gamification to be when people engage with the automated presence in order to try and break it, or to play with it, so to find out where its limits are. And I've heard other colleagues in artificial intelligence speak in the same way about it's apparently a fairly common thing that people do with artificial intelligences and agents, is to try and break them, to push at them. So in that sense, it's gamifying it, and I guess I can see analogies with practices of gaming, but that's the way I was using the term. Does that make sense? Does that answer? Okay. Yes.
I want to shout into your ear here. So I understood from what you presented on one of your slides is that you also fed the teacher bot in a particular way. Yeah. So there is a huge potential for feeding it in any other way. I mean, you ask questions and answer initially in your team. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Okay. We were new to this, so we had no existing kind of frameworks to think about how to program the teacher bot. So in the end, we divided the functionality into three areas. One was kind of administrative, the stuff that you were mentioning earlier, the kind of process stuff. One was content related. This is where we used extracts from the literature to prompt and probe at ideas. And then the third was pastoral, sort of caring, the kind of social elements of things like have a nice weekend. So we made sense of it that way. We had three areas in which we developed responses, but we could have done it in loads of other ways. We'd like to do it again sometime.
Hi, thanks.
Yeah.
So I'm a MOOC student, and I've been a MOOC student for about a year and a half, and primarily through Coursera. And it's starting to occur to me, what's the point of attending a physical university where you have to pay high fees if you're an American student who's paying $10,000 or $20,000 a year? So I wanted to know, do you think that MOOCs are going to, maybe take over conventional in-class education?
No, I don't think so. But I do think they've asked conventional in-class education to think differently about how they structure themselves. I think certainly at Edinburgh, we've run a lot of successful MOOCs now, and it's creating real cultural change on campus. I would say, with people kind of using the experience that they've developed in MOOC space to think about how they could make teaching in class better and different and more kind of more agile and more technologically oriented. So I don't think, again, it's this supersessionist argument. It's not replacing campus-based education, but it's changing it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was just wondering, from the message that is emerging from your presentation, the fact that as humans we should basically hold automation rather than reverse, really. How does that pan out with, if we're talking about education, or if you're talking about the domain of education, like institutional requirements, for instance, to become even ourselves more and more automated in a way, or even just the world. I mean, look, for instance, I can think of like post office in the UK, where lots of staff at the post office are being replaced by machines and stuff like that. So how does, the message that is emerging from your presentation seems to be, in a way, not contradictory, but is there an alignment there or not, in fact? I mean, is there a conflict or...
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, anyone who's got one of these is being tracked. I mean, the amount of data that these things accumulate every day is phenomenal, and that data is interrogatable. So it's, for me, the main issue is kind of awareness of it, being aware that it's happening, but also thinking of strategies as practitioners who don't program this stuff, how we use it, how we become aware of it, how we teach our students to be aware of it, and what we do with that knowledge. So I think over the next 10 years, we're going to have a lot of discussions along those lines. But it's important to open up the discussions and not always, I think in education, we certainly in sort of humanities and social science disciplines, we tend to be kind of in awe of data scientists or in awe of computational people that know how to work the programming and the code, and to think that somehow that knowledge is unobtainable, but it's not. It's knowledge, and we just need to, again, same as the answer to your question, we need to work across disciplinary boundaries to learn how to interrogate it. But yeah, it's a good question. Thank you.